Well, good evening, and once again, welcome back to Beyond Room 313 Symposium. Tonight's guest is a man that I followed his work for a long time, and I've met him a few times. I've never had a chance to sit down and have a chat with him because I'd be at events and things like that, and we'd be rushing back and forth. But I'm going to make up for that tonight because this is the chat I've always wanted to have with David Moore in person. We're going to have it here with myself and Jason and the rest of you as well watching the show. Now, David is an author from the English Midlands who currently lives in Cornwall in the southwest of England. And he wrote a book called Evolutionary Metaphors, which I think is one of the most important books written on the subject of aliens and UFOs and the whole UFO experience. Those of you who have followed my work for a long time, I don't normally talk about the UFO thing, but you are aware of the fact that I put it into the kind of Jungian Jacques Villette concept that they were dealing with some kind of folklore connected to human consciousness development, and very much David's work was in that genre, in that slot, but with a deeper dive, I thought, in many ways, mainly brought about through his scholarly study and essays over the years on the work of the British author Colin Wilson, who I'm also a big fan of myself. So this is going to be pretty fantastic tonight for me, especially because this would be a dream show for me if I was watching. So welcome, David. I'm absolutely delighted you've made it here.
It's a great pleasure to talk to you, Tom. I always enjoyed Sorcery, Invocation of Strangeness, which came out roughly about the same time as my own book. I felt they were kind of, along the same parallel lines.
Well, I'm glad you started off by saying that, because I think there's actually a lot of cohesion, is the word I'd use, between the kind of way our lives have been going in recent years. And Jason have often spoke about this when he left the military and so on. They all seem to happen around certain dates. Now, a pivotal year for me in all of this, in my own kind of like conscious awakening, was the year 2008. And lo and behold, that's the year that you had your alien experience. So would you like to tell us about that?
Yeah, the UFO experience that I had in 2008 was a life-changing event. I think it's more interesting to talk about the things leading up to it, because at that time I wasn't reading about parapsychology or the occult, although I'd had an interest in that in my early teenage years. But I sort of grew out of it. I started reading different, sort of literary works, along the lines of existentialism and philosophy. I was just in a general sort of existential search for meaning, the classic late teenage, early 20s thing. But me and my friends always used to go up to a woodland in the West Midlands called Ridgewood, which is just outside Kings Rumford, which is a small village in the Midlands, kind of a working class town. And we used to have a bonfire there. Late at night, we'd have a few beers, and that was it. I mean, it was a matter of a few beers because we could only carry so much up there. And one evening of the many that we went up, I sat down on a fallen tree, which had pushed out some of the other trees, so you could see onto the horizon for the first time, because it sort of pushed across all the bramble, and you could kind of walk up to the edge of the tree and just sit down and look out at this horizon, which is basically looking over Wales, which is just an extensive countryside, really, from the edge of the West Midlands. And I noticed then a white light on the horizon, which is quite common because you see a car come up over the hill and a headlight, and when it's facing you, it's very bright, and then it turns. So I thought it was just another car. And then I just kept my eye on it. And I know there was something odd about it, because it didn't seem that far away. It was quite clearly close. And then it seemed to creep ahead. And I said, that's not in the distance. That's just in a few fields away. And it slowly came towards us. And obviously there was a bit of tension there building in me, because you don't know what to do when there's a silent white light coming across a field towards you. There's nothing you can do about it. So you go into flight and fight mode. Your reptilian brain kicks in and you want to react. I was the one to react the earliest in sort of fear, and I ran scrambling into the woods. But my friends hadn't been focusing on it like me. The other witnesses were Christian Horton, he's a guitarist for Dark Forest, which is a metal band, and he was more calm and collected than I was. And he calmed me down, and we went back, and we saw it coming close, and it just simply went above us by about, estimating about 30 foot or so. It's quite close and low down for craft. And then it went completely red. And we were staring at it in just awe, semi-fear, sort of adrenaline pumping through us. One friend complained how hot he felt, and he had to take his jacket off. And this was in February. It was very cold in that wood. And we felt electrified by it, metaphorically. There was no sort of ill effects from it, but there's that super buzz of adrenaline, and it went away into the horizon very slowly, and then creeped across the opposite horizon, which was the opposite side that I saw it come. And then it seemed to go left to right, and then just vanish. And then after that, we were up until 3 o'clock in the morning talking about it. And I rushed home, and I wrote up an email and sent it to UFO Birmingham group. And it was after that, really, it just completely opened me up to the paranormal, the occult, the UFO, because I went on a radical sort of search. And the first person I went to was for Colin Wilson, because I knew he had written The Outsider, which is a classic study of existentialism, studying all the classic philosophers as Jean-Paul Sartre, Schopenhauer, Nietzsche,
Lovecraft,
all the classic, the dark, deep thinkers. And I noticed that he had written a book about UFOs, so I went to him because I felt he was reliable. And that's how it all opened up for me, because it connected two interests and opened up so many multiple dimensions and multiple doors into knowledge. And that's what I tried to kind of express and bring forth in evolutionary metaphors.
Well, the thing is, if you were in any other situation in history or culture, you probably would have described a religious experience. That would have been an angel or a god or some kind of messenger from the heavens. Now, when I was a kid, a friend of mine were standing on a balcony of a high-rise tower block in Dublin we lived in, and a big bright light came towards us. And it was, when I say it was bright, I mean it was like a halogen lamp. And we were screaming, "Oh my God, it's a UFO, it's a UFO, it's a UFO." And then it sort of moved off slightly to the left, and it turned out to be a small aircraft. It's only because we were the same height in the sky as the aircraft, like 10 stories up, in about a mile, 2 or 3 miles away, that the light hit us directly the way you would see it on the runway. But it was one of those things like, I was glad it happened because it made me a cynic about the whole thing at a very early age. And I've told this story. I've never seen a UFO until about 4 years ago. I saw what I described as a tic-tac shaped object moving across the bay here, and then vanishing at a very slow speed. And the impression and the funny thing was, not long before that, I'd come to the conclusion, I'll probably never see a UFO. And then I saw one. And that kind of like resolved everything that I'd read in Jacques Vallée. And I think I'd read your book by that time as well, or it was around that time. And Carl Jung's Flying Saucers, that this is some kind of experience that it's a trigger of some kind. It opens a threshold. Now, you said you had no interest in the paranormal, you had no interest in the stuff, but it stepped you into a world, into a level of consciousness. Do you feel that experience was designed specifically to do that to you?
That's an interesting one. It's something I thought a lot about. And as you said about misidentification, which I think is interesting as well, because I went up to Glastonbury Tour a few years ago, and it's exactly the same thing happened to me as what you just related. Was a plane flew over, and I because it looked so similar to that white light I saw in the woodlands, and then it was just a plane. But the level of adrenaline and the kick that you got from it, and the associations, and you think, well, what an experience, what a buzz. It sounds crazy, but I think there's something quite interesting about that, because that's about the symbolic attachment that you are in that doorway, that intensity, that you're sort of throwing a lot of psychic energy out there, and you're buzzing, and then suddenly it fades away, and you get drop of recognition. And it's humorous, but you can always reflect on that on a psychological way, which I think is interesting. What I should add about the UFO experience that we had initially, it was so low down and strange, and it didn't seem to operate on any mechanical level, in the sense that the lights weren't rhythmic. They had a sort of organic quality to them, if I could say that, like a bag of lights, almost like a jellyfish you would see in the abyss, that kind of thing. But as you said about if it was meant for that, it's hard to say, but it certainly has that effect. And that's something I thought about more recently about magic and psychology, generally speaking, is it doesn't necessarily need to be a UFO to initiate that opening, because you can attach, as so to speak, like a transpersonal unconscious force and connect it symbolically with an anomalous experience, whether it was just a mistaken balloon. And that could change your life, even though it might be rooted on illusion or delusion. And I think there's some interesting things about that, because in any crisis situation, which is a common thing talked about in Jungian psychotherapy, there's something in us that's always searching for balance and harmonization. And any sort of crisis can knock you out of your automatic sense of being. And you can suddenly experience miraculous synchronicities. And I think it's in that gap, that kind of leap and symbolism, that I think you call it in sorcery. Sorcery is the condensation of complexity, that you bring complexity down into a sigil or symbol or metaphor. And it has some powerful effect on the conscious mind, on the unconscious mind, that bubbles up, creating and generating immense imagery, energy, connection. And you're in the flow mode of consciousness, in which you kind of act at the peak experience of things. So I've always thought about the UFO experience being this kind of connective symbol where it links you into the deeper parts of the psyche, where you can link it with the archetypal levels of your being, so it unfolds like that, and it has that implicitness, and the more you think about it, the more levels seem to kind of come around and emerge from it, like a flower, so to speak. And I think that's where the bridge between consciousness, the UFO, the anomalous, and magic all kind of connect together in that way.
I was going to say, both of you had mentioned it being kind of an initiatory experience, and I don't know whether to call this a UFO encounter I had, or if it was a helicopter or what. It's one of those things that will always be a mystery to me. But it was the same time frame. I want to say it was either late 2007, early 2008, about a year before I was going to go into the military. It was one of those moments where, like, I went from being a dumbass kid to like going, my life went off in a different direction at that point. I was with my girlfriend at the time, driving back from Phoenix, Arizona to Southern California, coming from east to west, and somewhere outside of Phoenix, there's the middle of the night, 3 a.m., 4 a.m., somewhere in that hour. And we were driving back kind of half awake, half asleep, and that like kind of hypnotized driving across the desert feeling. And the way she recalls it and the way I recall it are slightly different. What I recall happening is we're driving along in our little Honda Civic, and a beam of light, to me it was a green light, came down and was on the hood of the vehicle. And I'm thinking, oh shit, it's the cops, like someone's pulling me over right now. Because at that time I was doing stupid shit, driving way too fast and, getting speeding tickets. And my immediate response is, oh, I'm getting pulled over right now. And it's the police, but it was tracking the car, this light. And it's just like, to me, it was green. She recalls it being blue. But it was as if something, I would call it, scanned the vehicle. It may have been some kind of helicopter checking my speed or something, but it was one of those things where from that point forward, I diverged from the path that I was on with her and went off into an entirely new journey in my life, a fool's journey, if you will. Joined the military and had to grow up a little bit. And I kind of completed that journey coming back into my own path. We were just talking about the same time frame. I was finding Thomas's work. I'm finding your work now here too. And it's just, it was almost an initiatory kind of my step out of childhood and my first step into adulthood. Yeah, same time frame though, 2007 into 2008, and then by September of 2008, I was putting my right hand up and swearing, joining the military, and I ended up, not being with that girlfriend anymore, and just totally having an entirely new life that was an incredibly mystical and magical existence. My whole time through the military was, I would say, mystical. It was not mundane by any means and I just got into all that stuff. I started looking into UFOs, and I went around all the typical stuff, the ancient aliens and all that, conspiracy theories, 9/11, and eventually found my way into the occult and Thomas's work. So yeah, I would absolutely agree from my point of view. Whatever that was, if it was just a helicopter or a police car, or if it was some sort of being, if it was a I don't know, an entity of some sort, or some sort of other dimensional beingness.
I can definitely say from my experience with what I would call a classic UFO that I saw about 4 or 5 years ago, that it opened up another level of initiation for me. I've never really had an experience with the aerial phenomenon until that, and then I've had them quite a bit ever since. I'm seeing strange things all the time in the sky, and that I've never really seen before. Now, I'd had plenty of paranormal or magical experiences and things I'd create myself and so on, just to test this stuff. But I'd never been airborne in that kind of thing until that day that happened. Even to the point now where I've seen the classic black helicopters, which was I have to say, if I was to look at the time, it was a surreal experience. Looking back on it now, I find it quite terrifying thinking about it. It was around the time sorcery came out, and there's a very large bog near here. And I used to go for walking for hours in that bogs, and these bogs are quite dangerous and desolate. You step one way and you're gone. No one will ever find you. And there's paths across the bogs. And there I was just sitting there, and it was a dull kind of day, and there's no air traffic. There's no helicopters like this around here, and it was not making much noise. It was moving like this. I don't know if you ever seen the original War of the Worlds film, but the Martian spaceships kind of arrived like that and then went like that. It was moving like that. It looked like a toy model helicopter, but it was full scale, and it was almost like a surrealist movie I was watching. And at the time, I was looking at it going, oh, well, that's it. Is that the black helicopters? The funny thing is now, when I think about that experience now, and even telling you that now, it kind of frightens me. I can't explain why, but it does. I think because the same event, the same experience I had with the first one and with that black helicopter was I was looking at an animal or something that was alive.
It had an unnatural quality about it, that sudden jerkiness.
Yeah, the uncanny valley.
Yeah, the uncanny value. Yeah. I think this is really interesting, that a misidentification can cause that sense of eeriness. I like that. I mean, that's in culture, and we watch films and read books for the same reason, because we all suspend our disbelief. And it's that sudden return to the real world where you can integrate that experience and take it in context. And I always like that idea. I mean, this craft that we saw, I mean, it could have been secret military technology and so on. You could always come up with these, but that's one of the many questions that you come up with. But I've always been interested in the psychological effect of just anomalousness, something you can't identify, and it does shake you up. I think that's the reason why people seek out thrills or take drugs or shamanic dancing, anything to shake them out of their ordinary state of consciousness. And I find it,
sorry, where it happened to you in England, okay, that's a kind of a magical area, that Welsh borders, the old Mercia, that kind of part of the world, King Penda and all that kind of thing, the last pagan parts of Britain and so on. I find that there is much connected to place as they are to person and experience, which is why I think sometimes they do get mistaken for military black ops, because they seem to happen in certain areas, rather than people saying, well, maybe this area is conducive to it. I don't know.
Someone sent me a link today to Nicholas Roerich, who's an artist, a painter, and he worked on Stravinsky's Rite of Spring. And I think it was around 1927, making it. about 20 years before Kenneth Arnold's initial sighting. He was up in the Himalayas or Altai Mountains, and he took a note in his journal, I think it's called Altai Himalayas, about a silver chrome-like disc that he saw, or some kind of chrome metallic shape that he saw through his binoculars, which he's following. He had seen birds, but he locked onto this bizarre, object. And he wrote it down in his journal, and that was published in 1930. That's 20 years before, the classic flying saucer origination story. And I think it's that makes me question the whole secret military UFO thing. Although that doesn't make, I don't dismiss that, because I think there's obviously secret military technology flying around. But the UFO myth, I think, or the mythology, or the reality of the UFO, in any sense, in any sense of the word, goes back much further. I mean, it goes into folklore, and obviously you saw in the 80s with all the abduction literature, which is fascinating in itself, and that mimics folklore as well.
Yeah.
A lot. Yeah.
Also, with the military technologies thing, military and governments have a vested interest in people thinking it's that. I think Roswell was a classic example. I think that was around the time that the Russians had detonated a hydrogen bomb, and it was kind of almost like Roswell was fed out there to the American public, saying, "Look, don't worry about it. We have spaceman technology." I think that's definitely been used in the United States. So that's the military technology thing. I feel the same way too. Yeah, of course there is military technology, but when you have someone like Prince Philip, the Queen's late husband, saying that he'd been studying these things for years, and what he come to the conclusion there was some kind of animal that lived in the upper atmosphere. We're obviously dealing with something that's way beyond simple smoke and mirrors by the Pentagon or by MI5 or the MOD in England.
Yeah, absolutely. The more I think about it, and obviously there's this disclosure thing that's meant to come out in June, but if you read any of the UFO literature, say Keith Thompson's Aliens and Angels, or Jim Mars's Alien Agenda, the classic overviews that just go over the whole field, you see that it's time and again. You got Project Blue Book and all this, and the Condon report, the Condon report, and they all claim to either debunk or reveal something of the truth from the government's perspective. But it's always sort of weaponized or carefully worded, and it dissipates into it sort of dissipates the myth, and then obviously you get more fervent believers in the disclosure idea, and this is where the whole UFO field splits into many fractions. You get the folklorists, Jack Vallée, John Keel, even Jungian ideas, and then you get the hard nuts and bolts. There's a spectrum of ufology, and I think that's what's so interesting about it, because it reflects every level of thinking. If you're a materialist, to the extreme end, it's military technology or alien technology.
Yep.
And then the high strangeness gets removed. The occult elements gets extracted out of it.
And I've gone to UFO conferences, and they're very institutionalized. Both the speakers and the people there want to hear about. I've actually I've actually met these things where I come and stand on stage. This is so and so. He has some great revelations to make about. And then he starts talking about the Roswell story and telling it. But these people want, and I'm like, everyone in this room has heard the Roswell story 50 million times. And they're not, I would be getting up and walking out saying, I'm spending my money to hear the story over and over again. And this is what they want. They want these constant tropes that are repeated and given back to them. I mean, John Keel, who you just mentioned, he was very angry against the mainstream UFO thing in the USA, and even Rosemary Ellen Guadalupe, she was booed off the stage at a MUFON conference or somewhere when she said, "Look, literally, this is to connect to a spiritual thing. It's not a nuts and bolts spaceship thing." And she was like, the golden girl of ufology for years. There seems to be a vested interest in mainstream ufology and UFO conferences and all those people to have a holding pattern where it's aliens, they're visiting Earth, we're not ready to notice that they exist yet. Lots of stereotypes, lots of cliches. The military have alien secret technology, and a classic one is that they've somehow interfered in our genetics. They either created us as a slave species, or they've somehow changed us or are changing us. Now, and this is all these people want to hear. It's really weird to me. It's like a church or something they go to, and they can be quite hostile to, like, I can remember about 10 years ago, I was talking to a woman in England who saw this weird helicopter thing. And she said it was the aliens. And I says, well, how do you know it was? I said, she says, I saw alien spaceships close up. And I said, okay. I said, yeah, cool. Again, what was it like? It was a weird thing to shapeshift into a helicopter above me. It says, that's fascinating. Yeah. And they were aliens from another. I said, no, hold on a second. What made you think that they were aliens from another planet rather than there's this jumping into the assumption that it's spacemen from another world? And as you said, all this, the esoteric, supernatural, occultic thing is completely wiped out of it. And there's a vested interest in it. I think some of it is commercial. There's a lot of people making a lot of money out of, like, talking about this stuff over and over again over the years. But I also think that the military and the governments don't know what this stuff is either. And they're very happy with the mainstream ufology to be pedestrian and institutionalized with spacemen.
And they've recently renamed the UFO to unidentified aerial phenomena, UAP, or, and then they show these blips on radar screens, and it proves their existence, or at least it's frustrating the military technologies, and the US Navy and all these kinds of leaks that come out to the Stars Academy and so on. And while it's interesting, I do keep one eye on that, but I also know some of the history of the UFO lore, and I sort of hold back from it. I mean, of course, that I'm working from a different angle because I was trying to work out what my own experience was, what it meant, if anything. So I read UFO literature as a form of making sense for myself, but I could have easily fallen down a hole somewhere along the line. If I went to conferences and someone said, you've been abducted by aliens, someone told me that. They said they're just talking to me. They could sense it. I took it with a pinch of salt, went along with it and walked away. But it's quite hard to process. Luckily, I wasn't I don't think I was a really vulnerable person. I was kind of, I wanted to think things through and come to it on my own terms. But I mean, I think what is important about UFOs or conspiracy theory or anything of high complexity or high ambiguity is that you have to take it, you have to grasp it without crushing it. You don't have to pigeonhole it, I think, and you have to be very careful where it leads you, because once you get a pattern, it freezes in your mind and you become frozen with that. And I think this is one of the things you warned about in a very good video that you did years ago. It's probably 10 years old now, that you did about, it was a warning to people who were getting into conspiracy theories for the first time. Yep. And you warned about people taking it wholesale, drinking the potion and just becoming proselytizers for the cause. And it's the same with ufology, I think we have to reduce ambiguity, the strangeness, the uncertainty, and we have to pigeonhole it. We have to turn things into binaries, either ors, the enemies, or the disclosure versus the cover-up. We like this kind of Manichean frame. And I think I've called it Manichean trigger. When something so strange happens, the first thing you do is try to put it into a binary category. Us versus them, it disarms some of the tension, it simplifies it. But I think there's also what Robert Anton Wilson called the cosmic trigger, which opens you up to multiple perspectives, and this is what you've got to grapple with and integrate. And it's much more flexible that way, and you're freer. You might be more alone in the sense that you go off from conferences, you don't quite fit into the mainstream narrative, but you're constantly finding and searching for things that connect with you on a more independent, individual level, which I think that's really what Carl Jung was saying. Individuation is his main idea in Flying Saucers, about that the UFO is a symbol of individuation, collective individuation. Well, I think you have to kind of mirror that both collectively and individually.
I wanted to ask both of you, we were talking about the UFO phenomena and extraterrestrial stuff. I've had the idea here for the last couple of years that those are two separate things, that there is a UFO or UAP phenomena, And I think there also is life beyond where we exist, whether it's actually on another planet or in some other realm, dimension, reality construct, that those two things don't necessarily have anything to do with each other. When people see lights in the sky, yeah, they automatically assume it's a life form coming here. But that idea that, okay, maybe there alien life out there. Alien is in, other than our life form out in space. Maybe that I don't know how to say it right, Aruma or Uma, whatever that was, if that was some kind of giant cosmic squid or something flying around out there, or if it was somebody's planet or wherever their reality construct that they're dragging around with them. But separating those two things from it being, the UFO phenomena being one thing, and then extraterrestrials, extra dimensionals, fairies, demons, all of that being something entirely different. Maybe there is some overlay there, but I wouldn't necessarily say that if there is life out there, they're not going to just come showing up here, on a like a weekend tourist trip of taking a weekend trip to Earth, and they're in their their covered wagons or whatever it is in spaceship form. But yeah, separating those two ideas out, what do you guys think about alien life being an entirely different phenomena itself?
Well, I would agree. I would agree with that. I tend to think personally the UFO alien. Well, let's talk the alien part of it, right? But that could include the actual lights and stuff. It's definitely rooted in the cult, and it's closer to things like folklore and demonology than it is to visiting spacecraft. And I don't think it's any accident that someone like Lovecraft would write about these things in fiction, and then he tells us later that they were inspired by dreams. There's numerous letters he talks about these things are inspired by dreams, and inventing this notion of cosmic horror and this thing of cosmic dread. I think he was closer to the truth than many of the fact writers of it. I tell you why I truly believe this now. I went deep into the UFO mainstream stuff in the early 90s. I was living in New York, and I used to go to this bar restaurant, and a lot of cops, hardcore New York NYPD type beat cops went there. It's one of the reasons I went. It was safe. It was on the west side. And lots of them told me they had were always called out for UFOs along the Hudson Valley, along the river, so the west side of New York on the river. And they said ever since the 70s, there had been UFO sightings over Indian Point nuclear power station, which is just up the river from New York. And it's in the Hudson, but it's not too far from New York City, and it's the main power plant for the city. And ever since then, there's been, so that got me interested in it. Then I started reading all the Bud Hopkins books on, the hypnotism things, and then John Mack and I read all the mainstream authors of it, and I found them all. I'll tell you what happened. It was kind of weird. I got a kind of a rush from it. It was almost like I would read a Bud Hopkins book. Great, throw it down, John Mack, and literally I could read a book in 3 days. I could, and like a 200, 300 page book on the subway. I'd be reading and I wouldn't want to get off my stop to go to work because I wouldn't finish it. And it dawned on me that I was reading a kind of a great fiction story eventually. Then I'm saying, all that, there's no proof. I threw the books down eventually, and that's when I was more inclined to go back to the belief that it was fairy folklore and even demons, stuff like that. I mean, Crowley himself said our ancestors called them demons or fairies. We will know them, and others called them angels. In the future, we'll call them something else, and we call them aliens. And I think the interaction. Another thing that does it for me is the interaction between them aliens and humans is almost identical to abductions in Celtic and Germanic fairy folklore. So I totally go with the entities for now at this moment. I don't know how David feels about it. That's how I would go with it.
Yeah, this is one thing I've always struggled with, to kind of think, you've got the physical aliens from other planets, and then you have the aliens or the other life forms that come through in ufology. Colin Wilson points out a lot of the trickster element of the UFO phenomena and the abduction phenomena, because it's always absurd. As if you read any like Whitley Strieber work, Communion, Transformational Breakthrough, the trilogy of works he did in the 80s, they're so surrealistic. They're like dreams. They obviously have some powerful influence on Whitley Strieber's life and psychology. But it feels like he is trying to unravel an occult secret or riddle.
Yeah.
And that it seems to have more in common with something out of the Society of Psychical Research, with the channeling of spirits, talking to poltergeists, which just want to cause mayhem, and then disguise themselves as angels and then perform miracles in front of children and families. And then 1 minute they're rough rogues, that died young and are bitter and want to cause mayhem. And they wear several masks. And then the higher form comes up and says, I'm Ariel, the overarching intelligence, in multiple personality disorders, which seem to be connected with spirit possession as well. But of course, there's all this kind of mishmash with hypnotism and spiritualism in the late 1800s going into the 1900s. And that sort of crosses over into abduction and UFO literature, I think, and blends in. And it's very hard to disentangle what's going on there, because if you read, the Uri Geller book with Andrea Puharich, the early one, 1970s, when they were traveling through Israel and getting all these surrealistic messages where they had to meditate on a rock to prevent a war in Egypt and Israel. And then they have to fly to a Moscow hotel, and then there's disappearances of objects. It's very Madame Blavatsky, very early theosophical literature, reflects all that early 19th century, late 19th century spiritualism, but it's put in a modern context, and it's spun with, the Federation of Galactic Light and all these channelings. And I think there's a dodgy crossover there. It's uncertain to say whether it's spiritual beings coming through, or just tricksters that are deliberately misleading people, promising them the carrot of enlightenment or world peace, and then vanishing, and then saying there's a landing of spacecraft that never happens, and then the cult, the classic cults explored in Jacques Vallée's Messages Deception, say that they stopped the landing or so on. Yeah. So there's that the loop of logic where they negate it. But I was thinking about it the other day, that a lot of it, especially the 90s and the late 80s stuff that was explored in Stargate Conspiracy with Lynn Picknett and Clive Prince about the Uri Geller channeled stuff, it's very strange because it's all very kind of conventional left-wing ideas about saving the environment. It wouldn't, if you changed some of the spirit messages with Greta Thunberg, you wouldn't know the difference. If she said she was the supreme overlord of the Intergalactic Federation of New Light or something, and then said what she says normally, this is where I'm sort of getting suspicious about whether it was adopted by military ends or conspiracy theory. This is a conspiracy theory, but military ends to see how people would react if they were told that information was coming from a higher level of intelligence, from a spacecraft or from an alien civilization. So I thought that's how they would co-opt spiritualism or channel messages. I think there was a Mark Pilkington in a book called Mirage Men, and there's a documentary made about it. And a man living, I can't remember where it is, but it's on the edge of some airfield or some military base, and they were beaming in electronic voices into his radio system, pretending to be an alien being. And they got him to do quite crazy stuff because he became deluded and obsessed with this as a real thing. So this is where I think there's a dark overlay between spiritualism, folklore, and a military influence. This is like a conspiracy theory, but you can see how they would co-opt these systems because they're archetypal. They tap into people's need to believe.
Oh, I have to agree with that. There's the whole thing of it having this kind, like I said, left wing. It's like the aliens in the 50s were echoing CND and 60s. The ones in the 70s was the environmental thing, which is growing in America. Remember the famous Indian who's crying at the litter, and then the world peace. The aliens will manifest themselves in humanity as world peace. And it was that famous closing ceremony of the 1984 Olympics in Los Angeles, where an alien spaceship flies across the stadium, and an alien comes down and goes, "We approve of this meeting of earthlings who want to share in peace," and all this kind of stuff. And so it has to be interconnected. There's no difference between Greta Thunberg's message and many of these UFO cult leaders of the 1960s and 70s. Almost, they're identical, actually. So there has to be either the intelligence services tapped into that, or they've been working on this template, and they kind of experimented with the mind control aspects within the UFO world and then unleashed into the mainstream political system.
I was just going to say my last little 2 cents with that as a caveat on there. Yeah, absolutely. I think all that stuff with, disarmament of nuclear weapons, that's all part of intelligence agency stuff spun up. But I was just going to say my last little bit. I do think that if there is life beyond Earth, it's not going to be coming here to enter. It's not going to want to have anything to do with us here on Earth, let alone even be able to contact us or have any interest in what our affairs are. It would just be like, we have no interest in what some of the bugs in the garden outside are doing. We're just totally separate life forms in general. And I just do wonder, is there life out there on other planets or in other galaxies? But it's never going to, I don't think our paths will ever cross necessarily. And they're definitely not coming here and communicating with us as telling us to be to put down our weapons and all that stuff, the way that the media and Ancient Aliens tells it. But I just do wonder, is there life out there? And I doubt we'll ever come into contact with it.
I think there must be life out there, just statistically. So, a lot of people dismiss it as unrealistic, which just seems to me absurd. I mean, how big the universe is. But in what form aliens would exist and what levels of technology they might have and on what levels they might operate. If you look at occult literature or anything like that, it suggests that human beings have capacities beyond our understanding from scientific materialist level. So aliens from other planets could operate in ways which seem paranormal, like the classic quote from Arthur C. Clarke that anything so technologically advanced beyond our civilization might appear to us as magic. And I think that's where it might be a crossover between genuine extraterrestrial life and what we might call semi-metaphysical or spiritual phenomena that ties in with tricksters, symbolism, and dream. Well, there might be overlaps there where the two kind of conjoin and become one and the same thing.
Let's roll with that, okay? Colin Wilson's book, the Space Vampires, which is made into the movie Life Force. Obviously it was this kind of an Uma thing appears over both. If you look at the whole COVID thing and the behavior of people and the change in people, Lovecraft never told us what actual dimensions and size the outer gods were. They could have been the size of a virus, It's almost like since 2020, March 2020, me and lots of us feel like we're living in that movie Life Force or the Space Vampires, that we've seen people change like in a kind of a body snatchers type of way, where there's incredible irrationality based on fears that can be easily, placated in terms of explaining them scientifically. Like the chance of you dying is almost minuscule. And then people are still terrified. It's created these schisms within even families, even couples breaking up over it. And then you have this kind of religious thing of this transubstantiation of the vaccines and all this nonsense. Rather, it's become way beyond a medical thing. You have people like Fauci in the United States being held up as kind of prophets and religious figures, where you can buy figurines of him and people sing songs to him, and we laugh at it and it's funny, but at the same time too, I think it's giving us an insight into something very, very deep that relates to the concept of perhaps, could this be in its own way an alien invasion of the consciousness?
Yeah, I've thought about this a lot. I mean, Colin wrote another book as well, Mind Parasites, which has become more relevant, especially with the political polarization that we see now, where you're either one thing or the other. And another thing I noticed was the way language has become very divisive. That I would call them projection points, where there's in the way that we communicate, there's always something put in there. There's a projection of otherness onto the other person that demonizes. Yeah. The classic ones I've seen is apologist, that if you defend a leader, or just for some of the values you might agree with, you're called an apologist, and it shoves you off in a direction. You're not to be dealt with because you're apologizing for the other things. It's interconnected. You can't say one thing without it implying another. Dog whistle's a classic word as well, which is only certain people can hear it.
Yeah.
I mean, you can say anything that's projected from that word. And I think the way vocabularies and the meaning structure about how we communicate now in COVID times, and I think the vector of infection, perceiving people as vectors of infection, means that we treat people's ideas as vectors of infection as well. So we can't deal with new ideas because we see them as potentially disease-ridden.
Yeah.
And I think that's why we split society down the middle. It's like we say,
well, that became very. In fact, you quoted on a Facebook post about a year ago or 6 months ago. I was on a group. I don't know what it was, an atheist or something like a debunkers group. I read them casually because I look at both sides of things. I'm not one of these things that goes one side or the other. I look at both. And someone had just mentioned about megaliths, and I had just brought up something, and they had showed some guy who had been in America who had been basically how Stonehenge was built, and it was very impressive. But he was an engineer, but he was using laboratory perfect scenarios. Like, you had a concrete ground flat you could roll the things on. Everything was perfect, like, and then I said, yeah, okay, here's a picture of me on top of something, this huge megalith on top of a mountain in Sardinia. Those stones were carried up. Those stones, some of them are 50, 60, 70 tons. They were brought up the side of a mountain from a valley 9 miles away 5,000 years ago, and then shaped and stacked on top. How did they do that using his methods? And then they all jumped in and said, oh, well, the aliens did it. Flying saucers. And I said, and they're all lots of laugh out loud, the usual thing. And then I said, no, let's look on. There's other ways of looking at this. And they said, like, why? I mean, like, and I said, well, maybe they had a different technology, or we don't know. Maybe gravity was different. And it was all like completely, I was completely ridiculed. And all I did was try to put an alternative point of discourse to talk about. And I posted on Facebook and I said, I'll never ever deal with these people ever again. And I think you commented, they're completely incurious, I think you said, when I was telling about this. And that to me is a defining factor in all this. I think there's people who are incurious, and this is not even in their own frame of reference. And something happens, or they're born that way, and they become curious, like what happened to you in the Midlands looking over Wales. It puts you into that frame of mind. This thing is not for everyone. I don't think it's for everyone. And I don't mean that in a snobby elitist way, like, oh, we're special, we're chosen to be like this. I think that literally, and a part of me feels sorry for people who are not this kind of curious for this stuff, who don't have a 40 and exploration thing, because it's definitely enriched my life in so many ways, and I know it has yours. How do you feel about this concept of the people who are open to it and this division in society? Do you think there's this whole thing where they're trying to shut down anything that's outside a robotic kind of human being? Do you think that's what's going on?
I think so, to a large extent. I read an article the other day about openness as a trait, as a psychological trait. And it said something like, it was talking about the left and the right hemisphere of the brain. And the right hemisphere is generally creative and open, and it makes relational connections, whereas the left wants to reduce down things to categories, binaries, either ors, black and white. And the way the language is structured now with COVID and the incuriosity is probably more to do with a certain level of strangeness or uncertainty or complexity, and they have to whittle it down. I mean, there's a certain sense of this that we all do and we have to do. And there's a healing factor to reducing complexity as well, because you can integrate it. But there's also the dark, shadowy aspect of breaking things down in a sort of schizophrenic or schismogenic way. And it has negative feedback loops. And I think that's the tension, is where there's great sanctimoniousness on one side, where everyone's patting each other on the back, you've got to give the thumbs up, and there's a sort of virtue signaling, a showing of virtue all the time. And I think that causes the shadow of the troll, the one that wants to stoke the flames of hell. Because he sees people sort of dodging their own shadows, and someone wants to go to the source and just cause hell for the sake of it. Anyone is curious or wants to just rebel or become an outsider, or even the criminal psychology can grow from that over sanctimonious, that tension, in the society where you can't say one thing because you're a bit judged or pigeonholed. What that'll eventually do would create a split in society where people just go, oh, to hell with it, I'll do what I like. And they might go too far to one side. They might become reactionary, and then some people that want more communal herd security, they'll go left. More disagreeable types will go to go the other direction. I'm not talking politically left or right. I'm just saying in direction. But I think people are kind of structured in personality templates. I think we all are to some extent. We have an artistic temperament. We might have a more business, practical side to us. And I think society kind of splits down that road. But when tensions run high, I think these are magnetized, and we spin to the centers. And we spin to the outer perimeter, and there's no center. The center doesn't hold. I think Yeats said the idea that when tension, the way things are going, it's spinning now, and it's very hard to maintain. It's like I said to someone, it's harder to be on the fence now because the fence is on fire. It's electrified, and people are shooting at you while you're sitting on it. It's like one of those mechanical balls.
It's almost like back to Jung again. They're trying to make everything as impossible to individuate. Like individuation has never been further away from Western man, ever. The whole, you can't individuate. Well, we can, but it's very difficult for people to individuate if everything is so polarized, and you have to pick that choice. If you're taking this in the field of UFOs and aliens and stuff like that, well, the individuation in that is the coming to the realization, well, I don't know what it is. I know it real. I know it exists for a reason, and I know it affects me and it affects other people. But I'm not going to say it's aliens. I'm not going to say it's demons. I'm not going to say it's spaceship. I'm not going to say it's anything. I just accept the experiential aspect of it for what it is. And that's the individuation of that. And an acceptance without the actual QED written on the bottom of the equation. And I think that's that individuation in everything, whether it's political, whether it's artistic, everything today, we're not allowed to reach individuation. Everything is put in this infantile polarization. And as a result, I think that's where the holding patterns come from. Okay, I don't want to go any further with this. I'm staying with this, I'm not going any further. And that's again, what's going to happen then is the shadow is going to erupt from below and tear these people asunder in some way, no matter what their belief package is or what their element of self-status is. It's always going to tear them to bits from below if they're not individuating. And I think this is what's happening with the effect of society with the COVID thing. In so many ways, it is a kind of an alien. It's the alien that's punishing humanity for running away from the path of individuation, and I'm not reaching what Jung called the senex, where your life is rounded out, and you then become the kind of the archetype male of what you want to be. And I think this is where we see this reflected in things like people on hormones, the changing their genders, confused about genders. Now, I'm not putting down transgender people or anything like that. I'm not doing that. I'm just saying this explosion of this kind of thinking is directly as a result of the inability to reach individuation as a species. Well, in the West anyway, as a culture. And I think even in the UFO thing, that's reflected.
I think it's very interesting. I think what you said, that the UFO phenomena teaches you to some extent to individuate, because when you start reading ufology or to try to make sense of it, you're thrown into the deep end to try to connect it all together, to make some kind of meaning out of it. It's very difficult because there's so many contradictory statements, convincing books, and then another book will diminish those. If you jump from David Jacobs' sort of abduction hypnosis books to Jacques Vallée's Passport to Magonia, they're both convincing, they're both brilliantly written, but there's a polarity in the whole field, and it's such high ambiguity. It's socially unacceptable as an interest, so you become an outsider by being interested in it. So you're always grappling with extremes, and to try to even within the UFO community, to call it that, you are it's an extreme thing to be interested in. It's Plutonian, it's the furthest planet out, and you're trying to make conjunctions with all the other, that bring it down to earth and express some meaning from your experience, such as my own experience.
The Betty and Barney Hill thing is just as plausible as Whitley Strieber's experience.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, I think it totally.
And then okay, I go through life and I say, okay, Betty and Barney Hill, that makes sense. Okay, I'm into that. Then you discover Whitley Strieber, and he's talking about the visitors because he won't use the word aliens, because he says, especially in Transformation, he really compares it to like folklore and stuff like that. And then you're happy with that, and then along comes John Keel with the Mothman prophecy, and then throws it off into somewhere else. And it's just, and that's the individuation. It's like being curious, but not having a fixity of dogma on the thing.
Yeah, I think that comes in useful in COVID times.
Yeah,
when the information that you have to process is so contradictory, even from mainstream sources which contradict each other. I mean, one day you might read 8 out of 10 people have got the antibodies. And there's all this data about, vaccine. And then you're trying to juggle so many things. It's high complexity. It's little wonder why people would go to, the safety of consensus opinion, whatever that consensus opinion is, because that's hard to determine as well. And obviously people go to real, extreme ends either way. And I think this is where the shadows operate in between those extremes, in between, where you can be hijacked by ideology very easily, and it takes great pressure to it and determination to maintain a degree of withdrawal from it, because you can become very frustrated with it, obviously with everyday life, and more extreme people, with more extreme cases, that it's very difficult for them to operate. So if their business has been threatened, and they will have to abide by the government's law, they have to. And it's perfectly understandable, and all of this going on. I think this is where the shadows are dancing and the tricksters come out, and people don't see them because there's no reconciling symbol emerging, And I think obviously when you get the UFO concept that's kind of floating in the news again in the background, it does seem like a reconciling symbol for some people, that there's something out there on the extreme limits that the government's promising to bring forth. And the disclosure, enlightenment or rapture or ascension, the kind of promise of that haunts us in the background. I think Carl Jung alive today would write flying saucers. I think we'd only change a few words. He might replace, Cold War with COVID or something like that.
Climate change, yeah.
Climate change, yeah.
Yeah, about 4 years ago, I did a conference in Texas, and there was some ghost hunters there were on the panel, and they had some great stories, and they're really nice guys and everything. And I got talking to one of them afterwards in the bar, and I said to him, he's telling me some great stories about like haunted places and stuff in Texas. And then I said to him, what makes you think they're dead people? And he froze. He froze. And he says, what do you mean? I says, what makes you think that what you're dealing with are the departed stuck on this earth, or, ghosts or whatever? And he goes, but I'm a ghost hunter. That's what I do. And I says, well, how do you know that not like what we call demons or fairies or something like that? And I thought he was going to punch me, because even though I'd said it friendly, his reaction, you could see that his own shadow in his ability to see beyond what they were was there was an orthodoxy there, and I was infringing upon it. And I don't think he had any kind of like feeling that you have to defend the purpose, defend it on purpose. He had just never heard an alternative viewpoint to what he was studying brought in before. And I think that's a great thing for many people who are involved in Fortean or paranormal studies, is to wait for the alternative. And I think when you get the alternative, then you get one step closer to finding the answer. Well, I wouldn't say to finding the answer, not getting the answer. You're one step on the journey rather than the actual final destination. Were you going to say something there, Jason?
No, not right now. I was going to go back, take 2 steps back from where we were, where you were talking about the trying to shut down people from everything besides just being a normal human being. And then David, what you were talking about with linguistics right now, And I just really do wonder if there was some sort of invasion of the body snatchers thing going on. Yeah, would they use linguistic programming and that kind of thing, so that people would think if there were a quote unquote invasion that they'd show up and blow shit up? No, I think the best way to invade would be to keep the infrastructure, the bodies, the suits that us as souls carry around with us, to keep that all intact, and then just move in and take over the planet, take over the infrastructure, take over the bodies that exist here, so that way you don't have to start from square zero and clear out all the rubble. Just take what's already existing, manipulate it to a way that works for their template as entities, whatever that is. Like if, like David, you were saying, they might have a highly advanced psychic state similar to what we have, but just in a different way. So they just adapt this society to be more harmonious with the way that they do things, and changing things to what's native to their state, and then just come in and take the bodies that exist here and let that be their planet, or let it be their reality construct.
They would use psychological warfare. If they were so advanced, they would use subtle techniques that would be quite hard to detect. I think Jack Vallée talked about this. He called it the thermostat theory. They might appear in lights in the sky for a certain few years and then change their modus operandi over decades. There'll be flaps of UFOs and then suddenly none for 5 years or so. And he said there seems to be a conditioning effect, like a Pavlovian conditioning of large bodies of society. And I think that is interesting. The linguistic effect on human consciousness is profound. I think the science fiction writer said, Philip K. Dick said quite interesting thing about that. You control people by allowing what words they can and can't use. And he also said something along the lines of, at certain points in society, lying, thieving, all the negative things that we call in society will become a virtue. So, if you live in a Soviet country, for example, stealing a loaf of bread might determine whether your family lives or dies. It's not a negative thing. I mean, it's a virtuous thing to steal. But I think we get into that extent in the kind of society that we're in now with COVID, where people will start to lie, and simply because they want to bypass certain rules and laws that might feel by restriction on their lives or business, on their family, seeing their loved ones, and the people will inevitably operate on ethics we would consider wrong just a few years ago, which now turn to the opposite, and they're actually virtuous from their position, from their relative life position.
I think people will go into polarized alternative realities or alternative methods of dealing with either side. Like one will go more kind of like very rigid and terrified. One will go across into a kind of an airy-fairy kind of thing. And that always seems to happen. I mean, like when the Industrial Revolution happened in England, you had the Luddites who were smashing machines because they said this was the end of like basically humanity if everything was replaced with machines. On the other side, you had groups like the Ancients and Samuel Palmer who would walk through the English countryside under full moon in summer and means like almost like states of rapture, and then it produced beautiful art and poetry from this. I think that has yet to come out within this COVID thing. But there's one interesting thing that we had a quick discussion about recently online. I've noticed that there's a growth in kind of an Orthodox Christianity at the moment, and I'm wondering if this growth in the alternative scene, there seems to be a lot of, oh, I'm with the real Jesus, this is the real Essenes, and all this kind of thing. It's kind of like, early pre-Gnostic Christianity they're throwing themselves into. It's almost like, is this a kind of an end time psychosis too? In that, like, we better make sure we have the real Jesus because we got to hedge our bets now and go right back to the very beginning. But I think that growth in Orthodox Christianity in the old scene is very much reflective of the COVID thing, and also on the other things. I think a lot of people had hope in Trump, being some kind of revolutionary force that would change, particularly America, when what he really was, what I saw him always was, as a trickster archetype to to change to throw an alternative in there. But how do you feel about this very peculiar I have to say, growth in Orthodox Christianity all of a sudden.
Yeah, it's something interesting I've been trying to keep track of. I've noticed a lot of previous environmental hardcore types that become disillusioned with the modern version of environmentalism and gone into hiding, essentially. And they've become converted by Orthodox Christianity as well. It's almost as if they're seeking some framework by which they can operate on a spiritual level, and they turn to one that may resonate with them for known reasons. I think it's just a seeking for tradition in some way, some tradition, and they turn to that one, and it just happens to be closest to hand. And I think every kind of occult, mystical, religious tradition, I mean, it all has its shadows and negative histories, but I think they're kind of climbing frames, mental climbing frames, and they grasp onto them and to learn from and give them security. It's like a security blanket in some sense. I mean, I enjoy Kabbalism and reading about that because I love the way it frames the cosmos, man's psychology, and the world of forces, and it gives it a harmonic dynamic, between the pillar of severity and mercy, and then the central pillar of union. And I find it a very useful thing to use intellectually because it gives thoughts of a certain frame structure that you can work dynamically with. And I think that's basically what religion forms for people. It gives them a dynamic frame from which to operate. And obviously it has its own drawbacks and limitations. And if it can crystallizes into an ideology where they become preachers or ideologues that want to dominate people and convert people, then I think it becomes suspect. But if it's used just as a symbolic framework to work from, to root and ground your higher intuitions and synchronicities that might need kind of certain frames of reference, I think it might be important. Obviously, that I think in a lot of afterlife literature, when people pass over, they see symbols of say Jesus or so on, because that's what they firmly believe, or angels, and it all seems to flux. And I think that's where chaos magic understands that flux and works with that flux. It knows that symbols in some ways are relative to what we root ourselves in. But I still think in some sense there are grounded archetypal forces which are real and authentic. They're not all relative. It's not like hyper postmodernity. But I think chaos magic understands like the phenomenology of religion and magic and sorcery and the UFO. So I think it's, say if people go to Orthodox Christianity, the more kind of artistic types might go off into chaos theory because they find it a broader palette of colors to operate with, and they could create their own pictures, and certain types need more, certain colors and tones. I think that's how it is. That's my own experience, and
I'd say that's pretty much true. It depends on the individual personality. I'd be more because of my own background, I'd be more inclined to move towards the chaos kind of thing, than more of a pagan kind of thing. But I just realized that's just me. There are other people that they might be helped who are just as, who are also, well, I'm not going to say also, but who are enlightened and on a search. And they might go on to something like Orthodox Christianity or Orthodox Judaism or whatever, Sufism and so on, or the I Ching. So I think like whatever software package, whatever template or boilerplate you can hold on to help you with this, I think it is important once you don't become dogmatic and preachy. And that's why I think this Orthodox Christianity thing is quite healthy in a lot of ways, because I've seen most of these people I've not have gone for it. I've not been very preachy in the kind of a Pentecostal evangelical way, which is nice to see. So it's almost like a kind of an individualized Christianity. So, I think it's like actually a positive development, especially when I got talking to some of these people, and it seems to be having quite a healthy effect on them. Jason, is there anything you want to say before I wrap this up to David?
I was just going to say, David, this has been a really, really wonderful talk here. I'm learning a lot from you, and I definitely want to be digging in more to your research and literature. I've really thoroughly enjoyed talking to you.
Thank you very much. It's been a good talk, very refreshing.
David, people can get your book, I know, Evolutionary Metaphor, at Amazon. Is there anything else? Do you have a website or a blog or anything like that, or what have you got coming up?
I've got a little blog called ritualinthedark.wordpress.com, which is mainly about Colin Wilson's work. I've got an upcoming book I'm working on about occult psychology called Worlds Together, which is still a long way off. I'm hoping to pull together more ideas about esotericism, symbolism, and things like that. It won't be about UFOs this time, but it might leak in that. And I'm accessible on Twitter, on Facebook, usual channels. Feel free to drop me emails or anything. I'm fine with that.
Great stuff. So thanks very much, David. I really loved this. Had a great time tonight. Finally glad we had a proper chat about this stuff, and I look forward to your future work. And we'll put a link to Ritual in the Dark below this so everyone can go there. And so thanks, Jason. Thanks, David Moore, and thanks everyone for another Beyond Room 313 Symposium. And we'll see you next time. Thank you. Good night.